US EVA 77 will begin at the Quest airlock. JAXA astronaut Akihiko Hoshide, noted by his red stripes, will egress first and receive the mod kit strut bag. EV2 US NASA astronaut Mark Vande Hei will egress second with the white suit, take control of the big bag on his body restraint tether, and head out to P4. He will momentarily pause to drop his fairlead green hook, nadir of the flex hose rotary coupler, or FHRC, and continue out to P4. Back at the airlock, EV1, Aki will work to retrieve his worksite interface extender, or WIFX, and follow Mark out to P4. Aki will also pause to drop his fairlead green hook, nadir of the FHRC. While Mark stows the large ISS Rollout Solar Array, or iROSA, modification kit bag, also called strut bag, Aki will complete his translation to P4 and install the WIFX at the worksite. Aki will then translate over to P5 to collect his foot restraint on his body restraint tether, and then return to P4 to set up at the P4 Beta Gimbal Assembly, or BGA. Aki will then translate over to Mark and begin assembling the ISS Rollout Solar Array mod kit upper triangle. Mark and Aki will work together as a team to build the triangular segment loosely, and then we'll tighten up the structure by driving the bolts to torque. Aki will then translate back and over to and ingress his foot restraint. Mark will hand off the large triangular segment. Aki will lean back and soft dock it into place and drive 4 bolts attaching the triangle to the Beta Gimbal assembly. Aki will then egress, reset his foot restraint, and then begin handing off the mid strut, followed by the long lower strut. Mark will move into position at the solar array blanket box and begin installing the left lower strut. Mark will do this by driving his bolt by hand 4 turns. Aki will align and drive his bolt at the mounting bracket for 2 turns, and then Mark will finish up driving his bolt with the pistol grip tool and then high torque with the EVA torque wrench. Once complete and the bolts deemed good, then Aki will be given a go to complete his bolt using the pistol grip tool, and that completes our minimum config. Mark will then reposition on the Beta Gimbal assembly. Aki will hand off the telescoping mid strut for install. Mark will work to soft dock the side pad on the BGA while Aki holds it in position. Mark will hand start his 4 bolts and then follow it with the PGT, and then Aki will drive his bolt to torque. The crew will then gather tools and reset for the right hand side. They'll bring the tools back to the strut bag and prepare the struts for handoff. Aki will egress the foot restraint and bias it to the right side. He'll egress the foot restraint and we'll repeat the handoff. First the mid strut to the BRT stow, and then the long 8-foot lower strut to just hold. Mark will reposition, and a similar strategy will unfold. Mark will position the lower strut and begin to drive, and then Aki will drive his bolts. Mark will reposition back on the BGA. They'll hand off the mid strut, and again, similar strategy for install. Once complete, Mark will translate onto the strut and drive the collar bolts. This will lock out the telescoping mechanism and rigidize the kit. Once complete, they'll tighten up the MLI, and Mark will reposition to the left-hand side and drive the collar bolts on the left-hand side. Aki will begin cleanup. He'll translate over to the bag, stow all the tools, and stow the bag on his body restraint tether. The crew will meet up and hand off some tools for the second task of the floating potential measurement unit, R&R, and Mark will translate over and retrieve the foot restraint on his body restraint tether. Aki will head inboard first with the strut bag and translate all the way back to the airlock. Down the CETA spur, change that out for the spare FPMU. He'll stow that strut bag in the airlock and return with the spare. Meanwhile, Mark will translate inboard from P4. He'll pause momentarily at the FHRC, where he'll go zenith to the zenith handrail path, and then over to the P1 FPMU. He will pause to unplug and put it in EVA electrical inhibit by pulling a connector aft and then installing the foot restraint at the work site. He will work to configure it to his optimal position and then ingress into the foot restraint and prep for removal of the FPMU. Aki will then translate back to face 1 underneath the MT and then back up to meet Mark up at the FPMU. He'll stow the spare for optimal positioning for handoff. During this time, Mark will ret to the FPMU and begin to drive bolts, 2 outer and 1 center, stow his PGT, and then install a handling aid for ease in removing this ORU, or orbital replacement unit. Slide it out. Aki will go ahead and stow the FPMU probes. They deploy via a collar, so they'll slide an isolator out and then release the collar and tuck them down. If needed, a wire tie will be installed. And then for ease, it will be temp stowed on Mark's body restraint tether, so it's out of the way. And then Aki will retrieve the spare from the bag, deploy the probes, and they'll begin to reinstall the box and remove the handling aid. Once complete, the team will then work to stow the failed into the ORU thermal bag and then stow that on Aki's BRT. Aki will then work to follow his tether back to the airlock and stow the failed back into the airlock. Mark will clean up the worksite first by re-plugging in the FPMU extension by taking the lever fully forward, placing the foot restraint on his body restraint tether, and he will also follow his tether back to the airlock. He'll go under the MT. He'll pause momentarily at the starboard CETA cart to stow the foot restraint for a later EVA. He will then return to the airlock for a successful completion of US EVA 77.